the story I'm going to tell today is drawn from a much longer one. Those of you who are tempted to try and follow along, that's going to be frustrating because I'm going to be skipping through it. Those of you who aren't, it may be frustrating because there may be gaps in it, but I hope not. I want to end anyway by describing the three pieces that I think Hegel's idealism comes in. That's where I'm going with this. The opening sentence of Forced Understanding tells us that the result of the development of empirical consciousness, understanding itself as perceiving, has been to bring into view for the first time what he calls unconditioned universals. Their advent ushers in the conception of thoughts, which are the contentful elements characteristic of the sort of conception of knowing that Hegel calls understanding. The first requirement on understanding this conception of knowing as understanding is accordingly making sense of the distinction between conditioned and unconditioned universals. We've seen that perceiving consciousness acknowledges only sense universals. Hegel's talk here of conditioned universals accordingly means sensuously conditioned universals. Thought encompasses, in addition, sensuously unconditioned universals. That is, universals, properties that are not observable. Those are purely theoretical. Where perception acknowledged entities that could in principle be known in two ways, either by observation or by inference from observation, thought acknowledges also entities that can only be known inferentially. The broadening is from a class of things that are occasionally inferentially accessible to a class that includes also things that are exclusively inferentially accessible. The only way to know about theoretically postulated entities is by inference, ultimately from something that's observable. In allowing that observable properties can also sometimes be known about inferentially, by contrast to understanding empirical knowing according to the conception of sense certainty, consciousness understanding itself as perceiving put in play a second mode of epistemic access in addition to non-inferential observation. And it's clear that at least opens up, makes intelligible the idea of entities that can only be known by this second inferential mean. But we can say something stronger. Empirical consciousness understanding itself as perceiving has not only provided itself with the conceptual raw materials needed to make intelligible the idea of unobservable theoretical entities, it's already committed itself to their existence. For its intellectual progress from conceiving what's knowable empirically as having contents that would be expressed in a feature-placing language, as sense certainty did, to conceiving what's knowable empirically as having contents that would be expressed in a term predicate language, actually commits empirical consciousness understanding itself as perceiving to the existence of entities that are not immediately observable, but are knowable only mediately by inference. And that's so because for it, what is observable, and hence real according to this way of thinking, is just the sense universals, the observable properties. The particular objects that have those properties are not themselves immediately observable. They're conceived as bare substrates, knowable in principle only indirectly via their properties. They're in effect units of account for the compatibility of properties, the particular also of the indifferent matters, as Hegel puts it. And for the incompatibility of properties, the particular is the excluding one in his terms. And it's turned out that a structurally necessary feature of a world containing observable properties that differ from one another in those two ways, both compatibly and incompatibly, is that the particulars that exhibit sense universals are not themselves immediately knowable. Only their observable properties are. My first interpretive claim, then, is that the topic unearthed and bequeathed for investigation by perceiving consciousness is the nature and status of theoretical entities, unobservables that can only be known inferentially. It's consideration of this topic that launches the transformation to a new understanding of empirical consciousness, not as perceiving, but as understanding, as grasping thoughts. My second interpretive claim is that in Hegel's discussion, force stands in allegorically for theoretical entities generally. What's motivated by the considerations put in play in the perception chapter is that more general topic. The consideration of force is a way of talking about the whole class of things that are only inferentially, epistemically, and semantically accessible. In the end, it's this fact that motivates the consideration of explanation, which is one of the topics of the middle third of the chapter on consciousness conceiving itself as understanding. I'll call the allegory that has force standing in for theoretical entities generally the Boscovichian Allegory, because Hegel is using Roger Boscovich's language to elaborate the allegory. It has as its center the distinction between force and its expression. The thought is that force is not itself immediately observable. Its expression is what's immediately accessible through non-inferential observation. In the allegory, gravitational force is not observable, but the accelerations it causes are. The presence and magnitude of the force must be inferred from its observable manifestations. What the allegory of force and its expression is allegorical for is the relation between purely theoretical postulated entities and the observables on the basis of which those theoretical entities are inferentially accessible. One of the main issues being addressed here is the ontological status of those postulated, only inferentially accessible, unobservable theoretical entities. The restriction to sense universals by consciousness understanding itself as perceiving expresses a residual commitment to identifying what's real, how things are in themselves, with what's observable. Once the possibility of unobservables has been put in play, even in the form in which it arises for perceiving consciousness, namely as the particulars that serve as the medium for observable properties, perceiving consciousness's equation of the real with the observable shows up as of a piece with the 20th century scientific instrumentalists' unwillingness to countenance as real anything beyond the observable, anything, in Hegel's phrase, supersensible. As we've seen, commitment to the reality of supersensibles is also implicit in understanding what there is as having the ontological structure of the thing with many properties. Thus do we see perceiving consciousness turning into understanding consciousness when its implicit commitments are made explicit. Allegorically reconstruing the structure that showed up for perceiving consciousness as that of unobservable objects with observable properties in terms of force and expressions of force opens a line of thought that leads as an intermediate result to the reversal of the instrumentalist ontological commitment that had been implicit in the way empirical consciousness can understand itself that have been canvassed so far. The observable expressions of unobservable forces show up as appearances, mediating inferential epistemic access to the underlying reality that is the forces expressed. What this is allegorical for is a kind of theoretical realism that turns the prior view on its head, identifying the real as what underlies observable appearance, accessible only by making inferences from that appearance. Of this conception, Hegel says, quote, "Our object is thus from now on the syllogism, which has for its extreme terms the inner things and the understanding, and for its middle term has appearance." End of the quote. What's observable is demoted from being the real to being mere appearance that is inferentially revelatory of supersensible reality. This identification of reality with theoretical entities is what Arthur Eddington famously endorsed in contrasting his two tables: the solid, colored, unmoving, perceptible table of the manifest image, and the constellation of colorless, charged particles whizzing about at great speed in largely empty space that he calls the scientific table. His verdict on their relation was clear. He said, quote, "I need not tell you that modern physics has by delicate test and remorseless logic assured me that my second scientific table is the only one which is really there, wherever there may be." End of the Eddington quote. The observable table for him is mere appearance. Now, Hegel will in due course reject this invidious Hettingtonian theoretical realism. In the allegory, the expressions of force can be no less real than the forces they express. One result of this discussion of the play of forces is the total decoupling of the concept of appearance from that of observability. The whole play of forces itself is unmasked as mere appearance, its observable and unobservable aspects alike. Nonetheless, ontologically privileging the supersensible inferential deliverances of theory over what's immediately sensuously observable plays a crucial role in the developing experience of empirical consciousness conceiving itself according to the conceptual categories of understanding. Within the allegory, this line of thought begins with consideration of unobservable forces and their observable expressions. And I've suggested at least a bit how I think this allegory should be read. But what larger lessons about inferential accessibility and the status of theoretical entities are we to learn by reading the later stages of the allegory? In particular, the doubling of forces and the move to the play of forces. Within the allegory, the issue concerns how we're to understand the unity of a force in virtue of the diversity of its expressions. The particulars that emerged from the experience of empirical consciousness understanding itself as perceiving themselves have a moment of diversity and a moment of unity or identity. The first is the particular as the medium of the merely indifferently different, that is, compatible universals. As properties inherent in one object, Hegel says metaphorically that they reciprocally permeate one another without, however, touching, due to the pure porousness of their medium. The other moment is the particular as a unity, excluding the incompatible properties, possession of which distinguishes other particulars from it. The way in which the including force is seen to consist in diversity, and that diversity is seen to constitute a unity, is, he says here, what is called force, when he first introduces the notion. In that idiom, the inclusive diversity of force is identified with its expression and its exclusive unity with what he calls force driven back on itself, or genuine force. The challenge is to understand both these aspects as equally essential to what force is. He says, quote, "In the first place, the force is driven back into itself and must express itself. And in the second place, in that expression, the force is just as much the force existing in itself as it is that expression in this being within itself." End of the quote. So we could ask, what makes the expressions of force diverse? That is, why does it have many expressions? If they're indifferent to one another, as in the original model, what distinguishes them? The thought behind this next move, what he calls the doubling of forces, is that each theoretical entity can express itself in a number of compatibly different observable ways because it's related to a number of other different theoretical entities. Examining this application of the principle that diversity of properties consists in relations to diverse others, one instance of Hegel's being for another, shows that insisting on a one-to-one correlation between expressions and what he calls soliciting forces is unnecessarily restrictive. The difference between two expressions of one force might consist not in the relation of that force to two different other forces, but in their relation to two different sets of other forces. Instead of one expression of a force being solicited by a single different force, differing from other expressions by the differing soliciting forces, that expression might be elicited by a constellation of different forces, differing from other expressions by the different soliciting constellations of forces. And it's with that realization that we arrive at the allegorical conception of the play of forces. The diverse observable expressions of all the unobservable forces are understood as the product of the interactions of each force with many others, in the limit with all the other forces. As already indicated, when the play of forces comes on the scene allegorically, the status of observable effects that express the interactions of theoretical entities alters, and it does so in two stages. First of all, it's demoted to being considered as the mere appearance of an underlying theoretical reality, how things are for consciousness by contrast to how things are in themselves. Second, what had at the first stage been considered an ontological distinction between appearance and reality is demoted to merely epistemic or methodological status, a distinction between the observable and what's only inferentially accessible, a distinction between things in terms of how they can be known, how they can be something for consciousness, rather than a distinction of what they are in themselves. So I quoted before Hegel saying, "Our object is thus from now on the syllogism, which has for its extreme terms the inner of things and the understanding, and for its middle term has appearances." And he continues, "In this what is the inner true has come to be for the understanding. For the first time and from now on, there opens up over and above the sensuous, as the appearing world, a supersensible world, as the true world." The true world, the world of things as they are in themselves, is now taken to be the theoretical entities whose interactions produce their observable effects. In the allegory, the expressions of the forces that constitute its appearance, what it is for consciousness. This is what I called Invidious Hettingtonian theoretical realism. It's a theoretical realism in that, like Hettington in his famous essay, it identifies the real with the theoretical entities that are postulated as actual, whose activity is understood as the source of what's observable. It's invidious insofar as it understands the observable theoretical distinction to be an ontological one, and turning on its head the implicit instrumentalism of empirical consciousness understanding itself as sense certainty and as perceiving, it treats only the theoretical entities as real. What's sensuously immediate, the touchstone and paradigm of the real for the two previous forms of empirical self-consciousness, now appears only as an epistemic means, mediating the access of the understanding to an underlying theoretical reality, which is something for consciousness only by means of inferences, whose premises are supplied by sensuous immediacy. The truth of the sensuously immediate world is the supersensible world it gives empirical consciousness inferential access to. He says, quote, "The supersensible is the sensuous and the perceived, posited as it is in truth." So, at this point, the concept of appearance must be decoupled from that of what is observable, in the sense of sensuously immediate, and reconstrued along the lines developed in Hegel's introduction. There, appearance is the status a way things could be has to consciousness when it's discovered not to be how things are in themselves, but only how they are for consciousness. That is, through the experience of error. In this sense, theoretically postulated entities can be discovered to be merely apparent, and observable ones can retain the status of the real. When what shows up in the allegory originally is the sensuously immediate expression of sensuously unconditioned forces, is reconstrued as the effects of the actual interactions of theoretical entities, the realization that those effects generally include both observable and purely theoretical ones becomes available. In the allegorical conception of the play of forces, the difference between observable and unobservable effects plays no role at all. It's important that some of those effects be observable, so that we have premises enabling us to find out about the rest inferentially, but that's just an epistemic or methodological matter, not an ontological one. The way this move gets made in the Force and Understanding chapter is that the play of forces, which in Invidious Hettingtonian theoretical realism stood in allegorically for theoretically postulated reality known about inferentially via the mediation of observables that result from the interactions of solicited with soliciting sets of soliciting forces, itself is unmasked as an appearance, as being not reality as it is in itself, but only what it was for the understanding consciousness at the end of its first tripartite experience, which led from force in its expression through the doubling of forces to the play of forces. At this turning point, Hegel says, quote, "The understanding, which is our object, finds itself in just this position, that the inner world has come into being for it, to begin with only as the universal, still unfilled in itself. The play of forces has merely this negative significance of being in itself nothing, and its only positive significance, that of being the mediating agency, but outside of the understanding. What is immediate for the understanding is the play of forces, but what is the true for it is the simple inner world." End of the quote. What's immediate for understanding consciousness is different from what's immediate for empirical consciousness, understanding itself as sense certainty or as perceiving. For the immediacy in question for understanding is not sensuous immediacy, the immediacy of what's non-inferentially observable, but the immediacy of what's thinkable, what's graspable by being placed in a conceptual space, articulated by relations of material consequence and incompatibility, Hegel's mediation and determinate negation. It's in this sense that the play of forces is immediate for understanding. It's a set of actualities interacting according to modal relations of necessity and possibility and impossibility, in virtue of which it's conceptually articulated, and so immediately graspable by empirical consciousness, conceived of as understanding, That is, as grasping thinkables precisely in virtue of their standing in just this sort of relation to other thinkables. The play of forces allegorically introduces a holistic ontology. The forces are actual only in that they're expressed, that is, only in what's produced by their interactions with other forces. But now what's produced by those interactions is understood in exactly the same way, as being of exactly the same kind as the forces that interact. How is this identity, as consisting in relation to others, whose identity also consists in its relation to others, to be understood? The facts that make up the actual world are compossible. They're materially compatible. They're merely, not exclusively, different from one another. That seems like a reasonable, necessary condition of thinking of them as making up a world. By contrast, the states of affairs that exclusively differ from actual states of affairs are not compossible or compatible with one another. Sour is materially incompatible with sweet, but so is bitter. And bitter and sour are materially incompatible with each other. White is not the only contrary, in Hegel's sense of opposite, and Gegengesetzt, that I'm claiming is in play here. White is not the only contrary of black. Red and green are as well. The cementogenic possibilia that surround each actual fact like a cloud don't make up a world in the sense of a set of compossible, compatible states of affairs. The actual world, like any particular object, does not have an opposite in the sense of a contradictory, even though properties can. The view being considered does not reify the necessity-structured, that is, lawfully related possibilities that strongly contrast with actuality into another world alongside the actual world. The world as inverted is not itself a world. It is supersensible, since unlike actuality, possibilities cannot be sensuously immediate, and so cannot even supply observationally delivered premises from which other merely possibles could be known inferentially. I think the difficulties that readers have had with the inverted world section of the phenomenology are rooted in this fact. Hegel is not describing the inverted world as indeterminate, in the way it would be if what were sweet in the actual world were simply not sweet in the inverted world, and what was actually black was not black. The inverted world consists of states of affairs that are determinate, like those of the actual world. But the inverted world is overdetermined. It seems that things in it must have all the determinations that are contrary to, exclusively different from, what they have in the actual world. And that's incoherent. Because the conception seems incoherent on its face, the related difficulty arises of explaining what motivates taking this conception seriously. Indeed, seeing it as more advanced conceptually than the supersensible world of theoretical entities, of Invidious Hettingtonian theoretical realism, and the supersensible calm realm of laws. After all, both of those conceptions have been, and to some extent still are, actually defended by serious philosophers. If it's only Hegel's own analysis of determinate contentfulness in terms of exclusive difference that motivates taking seriously this conception of a supersensible world, one is inclined to think so much the worse for his semantic analysis. While understandable, I think such worries are mistaken. The view Hegel addresses under the heading of the inverted world is a coherent one, and it has been and is endorsed and defended by serious philosophers who do not start with Hegel's account of determinateness in terms of contrariety. For the view he's considering here is formally equivalent to contemporary possible worlds' approaches to modality, epitomized by those of my teacher David Lewis. To see this, it'll help to compare the possible worlds framework, PW, with the inverted world picture, IW. In orthodox PW, we contrast the actual world as just one maximal compossible set of states of affairs with other possible worlds, also conceived of as, or as determining or determined by, maximal compossible sets of states of affairs. The states of affairs of the actual world are made intelligible by situating them in a universe of other possible worlds. We can then understand an actual state of affairs in terms of the truth that the actual world of a proposition construed as a set of possible worlds, namely those in which that proposition is true. Determinateness of an actual state of affairs is a matter of partitioning the universe of possible worlds in which it's situated. Two propositions are materially incompatible, just in case there's no possible world in which both are true. Contradictories are minimum incompatibles, propositions entailed by everything materially incompatible with what they're contradictories of. Since two distinct possible worlds must have some differences in the propositions true with them, and since they're maximal compossible sets of states of affairs, any two distinct possible worlds will have materially incompatible propositions true with them. That is, they do not merely differ, they also exclusively differ. Material incompatibilities of states of affairs, propositions, is encoded in what sets of states of affairs are taken to be genuinely compossible, i.e. to make up genuine possible worlds. Exactly the same information is represented by Hegel's inverted world, just packaged differently. Rather than contrasting the actual world with other possible worlds, each possible state of affairs is contrasted with all the states of affairs that are incompatible with it. The IW is simply the set of all the states of affairs that stand in this relation of exclusive difference or material incompatibility to some actual state of affairs. If this set is determined, then putting it together with the underlying material incompatibilities, the necessities governing possibilities, we can compute all the compossible sets of those states of affairs. What we do in PW is conversely to compute what's incompatible, non-compossible, with a given proposition, represented by a set of possible worlds, from the whole set of possible worlds, taken as settled in advance of the computation. The PW framework and the IW framework are formally equivalent. We can start with the universe of possible worlds and compute material incompatibilities of states of affairs or propositions construed as sets of possible worlds, or we can start by associating with each state of affairs, the set of all states of affairs that are materially incompatible with it, and compute the sets of maximally compossible sets of states of affairs, that is, the possible worlds. Exactly the same information can be packaged in either way. So my claim is that what Hegel is considering as the final mistaken form of understanding consciousness, understanding consciousness is thought about the relation between actuality and a necessity-structured set of possibilia, is a version of, is formally equivalent to, the contemporary possible worlds framework. Of greatest interest, I think, is the alternative expressive view that Hegel wants to put in place of this picture, which he rejects as still unduly representational. What's made explicit by modal claims, including statements of laws, is implicit in what we're doing in making ordinary ground-level empirical claims, which do describe or represent how things are. The key to understanding the relevant sense of implicit and explicit expression is realizing that one cannot understand what one is saying in making modal claims without understanding what one is doing in making them. For this reason, one cannot understand the relation between modal and matter-of-factual claims, the relations between law and force that are the topics of both IW and PW, while remaining wholly on the objective side of the intentional nexus. One must think about how statements of laws, claims about what's necessary or possible, are used. One must think about the role they play in explanation. What specifically motivates the positive lessons we're to learn from the unsatisfactoriness of reifying cementogenic contrasting possibilia is a fundamental conceptual difficulty in understanding the nature of necessary conditions generally, which was raised to begin with in thinking about force, and then again more explicitly with respect to laws. The issue is a version of Hegel's master concern with conceptions of the relations between identity and difference. How can it be that the items related by a law are at once distinct from one another and yet necessarily related, joined in a necessary unity? This is Hume's problem, and his response to it was the skeptical conclusion that the idea cannot be made intelligible. In Newton's second law of motion, force, mass, and acceleration are related by F equals ma. That this necessary relation holds among them is essential to what force and mass are. But if the law is a definition of force and mass, then it doesn't relate independently intelligible magnitudes, since they're interdefined. The issue has an epistemological dimension. If F equals ma is a definition, then it should be knowable a priori and doesn't require empirical investigation to establish. But the question at base is a conceptual question about how to understand necessary connections. The law determining the distance of that a falling object traverses in a given time, d equals kt squared, governs a kind of motion by asserting a necessary, lawful connection between space or distance and time. Hegel says, quote, "In the law of motion, e.g., it's necessary that motion be split up into time and space, or again into distance and velocity. Thus, since motion is only the relation of these factors, it, the universal, is certainly divided in its own self. But now these parts, time and space, or distance and velocity, do not in themselves express this origin in a one. They're indifferent, gleichgültig, to one another. Space is thought of as able to be without time, time without space, and distance at least without velocity, and thus are not related to one another through their own essential nature." End of the quote. For both force and mass, the necessary relation of one to the other is an essential aspect of its identity. Each can be what it is only by standing in this necessary relation to something else. It's equally essential to the unity that is motion, according to its laws, both that it can be split up into different components and that partition be in some sense cancelled by the assertion that the lawful relations among the components is necessary and essential to what they are. Hegel says, quote, "The difference then is not a difference in its own self. Either the universal force is indifferent to the division which is the law, or the differences, the parts of the law, are indifferent to one another." End of the quote. Now, Hegel is far from wanting to claim that this kind of unity through difference, identity as necessarily involving relation to another, is unintelligible. On the contrary, the task of developing an adequate way of talking about and understanding this holistic sort of identity or unity is at the very center of his project. So, what is his response? It begins with the idea that understanding the sense in which force and mass are distinct but necessarily related by Newton's second law requires thinking about how statements of the law function in explanation, to begin with, in inference. He says, quote, "The law is on the one hand the inner, implicit in itself, being, but is at the same time inwardly differentiated. This inner difference still falls, to begin with, only within the understanding, and it is not yet posited in the thing itself. It is therefore only by its own necessity that is asserted by the understanding. The difference then is posited by the understanding in such a way that at the same time it is expressly stated that the difference is not a difference belonging to the thing itself. This necessity, which is merely verbal, is thus a recital of the moments constituting the cycle of the necessity. The moments are indeed distinguished, but at the same time their difference is expressly said to be not a difference of the thing itself, and consequently is immediately cancelled again. This process is called explanation, erklären. The kind of essentially differentiated necessary unity expressed by law is to be understood in the first instance by considering the process of explanation. A law such as d equals kt squared can be exploited according to two different orders of explanation, depending on what one takes as premise and what is conclusion in an inference. One can explain why the stone fell the distance it did by computing d from t, or one can explain why it took as long as it did to fall the fixed difference by computing t from d. Hegel calls making these inferences reciting the moments that are necessarily related by the law, the cycle of necessity. The difference in the moments, in spite of their necessary connection by the law, is manifest in the different orders of explanation, the difference in what understanding consciousness is doing in making the two different kinds of move that I described. The new insight characteristic of this form of empirical consciousness, conceiving itself as understanding, is that the differentiation into necessarily related moments that's essential to the articulation of the objective world expressed by laws is unintelligible apart from consideration of the inferential movement of empirical consciousness in explanations that traverse the moments in different directions. The idea is that the objective relations among theoretical entities that are codified in laws can only be adequately understood in a context sufficiently capacious to include subjective inferential processes of explanation. The claim that the objective pole of the intentional nexus cannot properly be understood apart from an understanding of the subjective pole, and so of the whole intentional nexus, marks a decisive move in the direction of Hegel's idealism. It's of the first importance to understand it correctly. As already indicated, Kant already had a version of this thought, motivated for him, as Hegel motivates it here, by thinking about the distinctive expressive role played by alethic modal concepts deployed in statements of laws and the subjunctive conditionals they support. If the stone had fallen for t seconds, it would have fallen d meters. The expressive role of such conditionals is in turn a matter of the kind of subjunctively robust reasoning or inferences they support. Statements of laws and subjunctive conditionals are, in Ryle's phrase, inference tickets. They codify patterns of reasoning. Understanding what it means to say that the objective world is lawful, that states of affairs stand to one another in relations of incompatibility and necessary consequence, requires understanding the patterns of reasoning that those claims license. This view is a kind of modal expressivism. I see the move being made here as the second in a three-stage process of articulating ever more radical commitments that collectively constitute Hegel's final idealist view. The first commitment is to what I've called conceptual realism. The second commitment is to what I call objective idealism. And the third is to what I call conceptual idealism. I offer these claims as a tripartite analysis of Hegel's idealism, claiming that his view is what you get if you endorse all of them. I take it they form a hierarchy, with each commitment presupposing those that come before it. As I read it, conceptual realism appears on the stage already in the introduction, though not, of course, in the detail that'll be filled in later on. This is the view, roughly put, that the objective realm of facts about empirical, but not necessarily observable, things, no less than the subjective realm of thought about them, is conceptually structured. Only an account that underwrites this commitment, Hegel thinks, can satisfy what I've called the genuine knowledge condition, that when things go right, what things are for consciousness is what they are in themselves. Hegel's way of articulating conceptual realism depends on his non-psychological conception of the conceptual. To be conceptually contentful is to stand in conceptual relations to other such conceptually contentful items. And conceptual relations are relations of material incompatibility, exclusive difference or contrariety on the one hand, and material consequence on the other. Those relations that Hegel calls determinate negation and mediation. The picture of the intentional nexus at this stage is hylomorphic. One and the same conceptual content, functionally defined by the incompatibility and consequence relation it stands in to others, can take two forms, objective and subjective. In its objective form, for instance, as the intricate structure of facts about particulars exhibiting universals that emerges at the end of the perception chapter, conceptual content is determined by alethic modal relations of incompatibility and consequence. They concern what's impossible or possible and what's necessary. In its subjective form, conceptual content is determined by deontic normative relations of incompatibility and consequence. They concern what commitments one can be jointly entitled to, and when commitment to one content entails commitment to another. The objective idealism that comes into view in the Force and Understanding chapter is a thesis about understanding. More specifically, it's a view about the relation between understanding the subjective pole of the intentional nexus and understanding the objective pole. I take it to be a symmetric claim. One cannot understand the objective pole without understanding the subjective pole, and vice versa. There's a semantic difference between two sorts of dependence relations that's fundamental to understanding the thesis of objective idealism. This is the distinction between reference dependence and sense dependence of concepts. This distinction begins with the Fregean distinction between sense and reference, his Sinn and Bedeutung. Now, later on, when I talk about the reason section, I'll talk about Hegel's version of these, so why it's legitimate to invoke this here. X's are sense-dependent on Y's, just in case one cannot in principle count as grasping the concept X unless one also grasps the concept Y. In this sense, the concept sunburn is sense-dependent on the concept sun and burn. And the concept parent is sense-dependent on the concept child. As these examples show, sense dependence can be either asymmetric, as in the first example, or symmetric, as in the second. X's are reference-dependent on Y's, just in case there cannot be X's, the reference of the concept X, unless there are Y's, reference of the concept Y. If Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicking over a lantern was indeed the necessary and sufficient cause of the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, then the concept, the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, is reference-dependent on the concept Mrs. O'Leary's cow. Of course, one could understand the former concept without understanding the latter. But the first concept would not refer to anything if the second didn't. So there can be reference dependence without sense dependence. Sometimes the two relations do go together, as with parent-child or cause and effect, which are both reciprocally sense-dependent and reciprocally reference-dependent. The case that matters for thinking about what I'm calling objective idealism is that of concepts that stand in a relation of sense dependence, but unlike, say, superior and subordinate, not also in a relation of reference dependent. One kind of example is provided by subjunctive response-dependent concepts and the properties they refer to. Suppose we define something as beautiful star, just in case it would be responded to with pleasure were it to be viewed by a suitable human observer. Then, one cannot understand the concept beautiful star unless one understands the concept pleasure, as well as others such as suitable human observer. Then, one can ask whether the existence of beautiful star objects depends on the existence of pleasurable responses by suitable human observers. For instance, were there beautiful star sunsets before there were any humans? And would there have been beautiful star sunsets even if there never had been humans? It seems clear that there were, and there would have been. For even if the absence of suitable human observers means that sunsets are in fact not observed, and so not responded to by suitable human observers at all, never mind with pleasure, that had there been such observers, they would have responded with pleasure. And that's enough for them to count as beautiful star. So, there can be sense dependence without reference dependence. And this is the sort of relation that I take Hegel to be claiming between law and explanation. The concept law is sense-dependent, but not reference-dependent on the concept explanation. In order to understand what law is, one must understand how statements of law function inferentially in explanations. Only grasping the latter, the process that Hegel calls traversing the moments in inferences explaining one fact in terms of another by means of lawful relations between them, can make intelligible the distinctive sort of necessary unity of what are nevertheless claimed to be distinct, in Hegel's phrase, moments in a law, such as Newton's second law of motion. The claim is not that if there were no explanations, there would be no laws. Newton's second law held before there were humans and would still hold even if there never had been and never would be. What is new with objective idealism is this sense dependence claim. This form of understanding consciousness realizes that it cannot make sense of the notion of law except in terms that appeal to processes of explanation. The objective idealism that emerges for understanding consciousness is accordingly a reciprocal sense dependence of the concepts articulating the objective things and relations, and the concepts articulating the subjective thoughts and practices of understanding consciousness itself. Given what's gone before, this reciprocal sense dependence is not limited to laws governing the objective world and the inferential manipulation of thoughts by subjects in explanation. So, we can infer from the discussion of perceiving consciousness's experience of an objective world with a small a Aristotelian metaphysical structure that the concepts of property or universal on the one hand and the concept of what one is doing in classifying by applying predicates on the other are reciprocally sense-dependent. One cannot understand either one without understanding the other. Similarly, the concepts of object or particular and the concepts of referring with singular terms are reciprocally sense-dependent. Given the notion of fact that perceiving consciousness bequeaths to understanding consciousness, we can add the reciprocal sense dependence of that concept on the side of the objective world with that of the practice of claiming, judging, or asserting using declarative sentences on the side of subjective practices. So the fine structure of the commitment I'm calling objective idealism is articulated into a triad of triads that stand to one another in relations of reciprocal sense dependence. And that's the chart in your handout. For Hegel, remember, all these issues come down to the concept of determinate negation. The metaphysical analysis by perceiving consciousness of particulars and universals in the Aristotelian structure of objects with many properties stays as resolutely on the objective side of the intentional nexus as can well be. As we saw, all he requires is the distinction, inherited from empirical consciousness understanding itself as sense certainty, between two kinds of difference: compatible or mere indifferent difference, and incompatible or exclusive difference, contrariety. This distinction, he takes it, by contrast to British empiricists, is a feature of immediate sense experience. Appealing only to these two kinds of difference, Hegel is able, in a tour de force of analysis and construction, to elaborate on behalf of perceiving consciousness a richly articulated structure of facts about the possession by particulars of sense universals, objects with many observable properties. This order of explanation shows that for Hegel, if there's a reciprocal sense dependence relation between the notion of material incompatibility that applies to properties, hence facts, and is expressed in laws in the objective realm, and the notion that applies to classification by applying predicates, making claims and judgments, and explanatory inferences in the subjective realm of thought, then the corresponding sense dependences will hold at all of the levels retailed in that chart. The experience of error is an important element of perceiving consciousness's own understanding. For what one must do in order thereby to count as taking or treating two properties as incompatible in the objective sense, made explicit by alethic modal locutions, is precisely to acknowledge the obligation, when one finds oneself committed to attributing those properties to one and the same object, of rejecting at least one of those commitments. One does that by treating those commitments as incompatible in the sense made explicit by deontic normative locutions. One cannot be entitled to both commitments. So one cannot in principle understand the sort of modal incompatibility that will be codified in laws unless one understands what it's appropriate to do when confronted with deontically incompatible commitments. And what one must do is respond to the experience of error by making an inference that explains it, by rejecting at least one of them. Objective incompatibility and the experience of error are reciprocally sense-dependent concepts. Because they are so are the concepts articulated and elaborated in terms of determinate negation as retailed in the chart. The dependence of the objective on the subjective that Hegel's asserting is a sense-dependence relation. The objective world is understood as it were, semantically mind-dependent, not causally or existentially mind-dependent. The latter extravagant and implausible view is a kind of subjective idealism, sometimes extrapolated from Berkeley and sometimes libelously attributed to Fichte. Whatever the justice of those associations, there's nothing of the sort in Hegel. As I indicated earlier, I'm analyzing absolute idealism as comprising three component theses: conceptual realism, objective idealism, and conceptual idealism. To assess the interest of absolute idealism as so conceived, one must look at it whole. As I read this final chapter of the consciousness section of the Phenomenology, conceptual idealism is in fact introduced here as the triumphant final move, motivating the expository transition to the consideration of self-consciousness. That thesis does not arise in connection with the move from force to law and explanation, but with the move from the latter to the conception that Hegel calls infinity. Nonetheless, the question of whether adding objective idealism as a reciprocal sense dependence thesis to conceptual realism represents a substantial conceptual and doctrinal advance, and if so, why? That's a legitimate question. It can be addressed precisely by thinking of what it adds to conceptual realism. Conceptual realism is the thesis that the objective world, the world as it is in itself, no less than the realm of subjective activity that shapes that world as it is for consciousness, is conceptually structured. John McDowell is endorsing conceptual realism in this sense when he says in Mind and World that, quote, the conceptual has no outer boundary, end quote, beyond which lies a non-conceptual reality. As I've been reading him, Hegel's version of this thought has a hylomorphic shape. Conceptual contents can show up in two different forms, an objective form and a subjective form. The first is a matter of how things are in themselves, the second of how they are for consciousness. These are reality and appearance, the phenomena and the noumena. Because both forms are conceptually articulated, and because the very same content can show up in both forms, quote, when we say and mean that such and such is the case, we and our meaning do not stop anywhere short of the fact, but we mean this is so, as Wittgenstein puts the point. This is how the genuine knowledge constraint is to be satisfied. That is, the criterion of adequacy on semantic theories that requires that they not rule out on conceptual grounds the very possibility that what things are for consciousness can be what they are in themselves. Hegel fills in this hylomorphic picture by offering a non-psychological conception of the conceptual. According to this conception, to be conceptually contentful is to stand to other such contentful items in relations of material incompatibility and consequence, that is, determinate negation and mediation. This definition is sufficiently abstract and generic that it need not appeal to what it is to grasp a conceptual content in order to say what such contents are. It invokes only very general relations among contents. For objective states of affairs, including facts, these are alethic modal relations of non-compossibility and necessity. They're expressed by statements of laws of nature. Mammalian life is impossible at 1085 degrees C, and copper necessarily melts at 1085 degrees C. For subjective thinkings of conceptually contentful thinkables, these are deontic normative relations of entitlement and commitment. The claim that the mammal is alive is incompatible with the claim that its average temperature is 1085 degrees C, in the sense that you can't be entitled to both of those commitments. And the claim that the temperature of the copper is above 1085 degrees C commits one to the claim that it's not solid. Objective idealism adds to this hylomorphic version of conceptual realism a thesis about the interdependence, in the sense of sense dependence, of these two forms that conceptual contents can take, alethic and deontic, objective and subjective. In order to grasp the concept conceptual content, which can take the two forms, it turns out one must grasp these two forms in their interdependence, their intersense dependence. On my analysis, the objective idealist reciprocal sense dependence thesis takes on its substantive and distinctive significance for Hegel in the context of the three other strategic commitments I already mentioned: conceptual realism, an understanding of conceptual articulation as consisting in relations of material incompatibility and consequence, and the hylomorphic rendering of that latter view as a response to the requirements set by the genuine knowledge condition. It's the latter that brings the intentional nexus into play in the form of the relation between what things are in themselves and what they are for consciousness. Against this background, in asserting the reciprocal sense dependence of the alethic modal metaconcepts that we use to make explicit the conceptual structure of the objective pole, what things are in themselves, and the deontic normative metaconcepts we use to make explicit the conceptual structure of the subjective pole, what things are for consciousness, objective idealism marks a significant advance, for it provides additional clarification and substantial development of this hylomorphic form of conceptual realism. It tells us something important about the relations between the two different readings, alethic and deontic, of incompatible and consequence. Namely, that one crucial such relation is reciprocal sense dependence. That is, the necessary relation between the different alethic modal and deontic normative senses of relations of material incompatibility and consequence, the kind of unity through difference they stand in as forms of one kind of content, is just the intentional nexus, the relation between thought and what it's about, between sense and referent. Objective idealism tells us we can't understand the ontological structure of the objective world, its coming as law-governed facts about the properties of objects, except in terms that make essential reference to what subjects have to do in order to count as taking the world to have that structure, even though the world could have that structure in the absence of any subjects or their epistemic activities. The sort of unity through essential difference that objective idealism attributes to conceptual contents by explaining how their objective, alethic modal, and subjective, deontic normative forms are related is fundamentally different from that grasped by understanding consciousness in its thought about force and its expression, and force and law. Those concerned only the objective pole of the intentional nexus, what's known or represented. Objective idealism concerns both poles, the relation between what things are objectively or in themselves and what they are subjectively or for consciousness. And both of those conceptions of understanding consciousness concern themselves with reference dependence relations as well as sense dependence relations. That's part of what's wrong with reifying laws as superfacts, represented in a sense that's assimilated to the sense in which ordinary empirical facts, whether immediately observable or not, are represented. So it's not the case that the relation of law to explanation and the distinctive kind of identity between its moments it involves should be thought of as modeled on those earlier relations and the kind of identity they involve. Rather, a kind of self-referential meta-claim is being made. It's only by understanding the kind of identity of content requiring diversity of form, characteristic of the reciprocal sense dependence of concepts articulating the structure of the objective represented world and concepts articulating the structure of the epistemic activity of representing subjects, that one can understand the kind of identity constituted by the necessary relation of diverse moments characteristic of the objective pole of that intentional relation, the relation of force to its expression, the play of forces, and of both to the laws that govern them. That's the lesson of the experience of understanding consciousness. There's a final further lesson on the way, the conceptual idealism that Hegel propounds under the heading of infinity, and that's the topic of my next lecture.